بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. ربنا زدنا علما وإخلاصا ربنا زدنا علما وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين وعملا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في غزة وفي لبنان وفي مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن عبادك في لبنان وفي غزة وفي مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربنا وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم تقبل شهدانا اللهم تقبل شهدانا اللهم تقبل إمامنا وقائدنا وسيدنا السيد نصر الله وسائر قادة المجاهدين الشهداء يا رب العالمين. اللهم تقبل شهدانا اللهم تقبل شهدانا اللهم ارحم شهدانا اللهم اغفر موتانا اللهم واشف جرحانا وأسرانا وفك أسرانا اللهم اشف جرحانا ومرضانا وفك أسرانا. اللهم اصلح كل فاسد من أمور المسلمين. اللهم إنا نتوسل إليك بشهداء غزة وبشهداء لبنان وبشهداء آل فاطمة أن تقبل دعاءنا وتحقق رجانا. وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. آمين آمين يا رب العالمين. Okay, so we had stopped here, but let's go back a bit. So Russell, what does Russell say? But the concept of matter has received the greatest blow from the hand of Einstein, another eminent physicist, whose discoveries have laid the foundation for far-reaching revolution in the entire domain of human thought. Mr. Russell says, the theory of relativity by merging time into space-time has damaged the traditional notion of substance more than all the arguments of the philosopher. Matter for common sense is something which persists in time. But that's why he says that. That's the first thing why. But matter for common sense. We are not talking about common sense. We are talking about the traditional notion of substance, isn't it? It is something which persists in time and moves in space. Are we talking about matter or substance? Is this Russell's quote or is it Iqbal? So, matter for common sense is something. Let me see. Okay, so matter for common sense is something which persists in time and moves in space. Okay, but that's not for philosophy necessarily, or for metaphysics, but for modern relativity physics, this view is no longer tenable. A piece of matter has become not a persistent thing. But here it's talking about matter, but started with substance. Matter is not the same thing as substance. Matter is something more general, but a system of interrelated events. The old solidity that's, is gone, and with it the characteristic that to the materialist made characteristics that to the materialist made matters seem more real and fleeting than thought. No, it's nothing to do with solidity. I'm having some difficulty in ascertaining where does Russell's quote start. So obviously it's starting here. Um, and I'm assuming that it stopped here. That's Russell's quote. Double check. Okay, so it looks like this is Russell's quote. Anyway, at least it is what Iqbal wants us to consider. So there are a lot of things we need to talk about in this quotation and Allama Iqbal's related conclusions. Okay, substance. We've talked in other videos about substance. Substance. We talk about Aristotle's conception of substance. That's important. And then Descartes' conception of substance. And the third one is Locke's. For all these conceptions, they basically go back to Aristotle's conception. And the basic idea is this, without going into details. The basic idea is this. Generally speaking, there are two types of things. In this world. The type of things, obviously it is always relative in a sense, but other things being equal. There are some things which can exist on their own. So they are self-subsisting. And there are some other things which we can't think of existing on their own. They exist in something which has more endurance or permanence. So, a very simple example is that of a chair. Chair is, in Aristotelian term, a primary substance, in the sense that it can exist on its own. But color, for example, is not a substance, because although color can exist in chair, a chair can be red, chair can be white, chair can be black, but we can't think of color existing on its own without attached to something else which is more permanent. That's the basic idea. Obviously, there are philosophers who think that color can exist on its own. There's a form of color which exists on its own in some realm. But this is Aristotelian idea, and that Aristotelian idea in various ways persist in Descartes as well as Locke. And in this sense, despite their all rebellion against Aristotle, they're still disciples of Aristotle in that sense. And that is understandable because they were both schooled in or educated in, or in a tradition which generally belonged to us, in which Aristotle was a very prominent, if not the central figure. Okay, so this is what substance is. Now, in light of this, let's analyze Mr. Russell's passage again. So, according to Allama Iqbal, Mr. Russell says that the theory of relativity by merging time into space. So, space is 3 dimensions. And time is merged into it as a 4th dimension. By merging space-time has damaged the traditional notion of substance. Okay. How so? How and why? That's the question. Mr. Russell says that more than the arguments of all the philosophers in our time who have railed against the conception of substance, for Russell were Hume, Berkeley, and others, but these are the one who come to mind in the Lockean tradition anyway. Okay, how so damage the notion of substance more than all the arguments of the philosopher? Okay, now here's the problem with this quotation. Matter. So from substance it goes to matter. So that's not clear. Matter as such is substance. Because for Aristotle, for example, matter is an abstraction in a sense. So, but matter for us is always with form, some sort of form. So chair, you have chair which is made up of matter, but it's not matter as form as well. And wood is matter obviously, but it's not just matter, it's form as well. So pure matter is an abstraction. That's the first problem. And so he makes a claims about matter, substance, but then goes on to substitute matter for substance, but substance and matter are not the same thing in this context. That's the first problem with this quotation. Now, second problem with this quotation is that it starts with the theory of relativity by merging time and space has damaged the traditional notion of substance. More traditional, by which I mean by which I understand, broadly Aristotelian, Lockean, Cartesian conception of matter, which I just described in a very layman term. But traditional notion of substance is not common sense. So that's another jump in the argument. The first jump is from substance to matter. They are not the same things. And traditional notion of substance to common sense, they are not the same thing. That's the second problem with this argument. So matter for common sense is something which persists in time and moves in it. Persists in time. Moves in space. Not matter. For example, a matter for Aristotle, for example, matter is an abstraction. It can't move as such. And matter only moves because it acquires form. And that's because matter is potentiality in a way. Potentiality to acquire form. And that's how this potentiality can become actuality. So that's why there's a movement. Because matter as an abstraction from all forms is a potentiality, pure potentiality. And when any mover moves it and gives it form, it becomes actual. And the movement is because of the gap between potentiality and actuality. And not because something which persists in time and moves in space. Because time in this context is different theoretical function than the function of time or space-time in Einstein theory. Okay, so this is the third point. The fourth point is, what does he say? He says that matter for common sense is something which persists in time and moves in space. Okay, but for modern relativity physics, this view is no longer tenable. Why? Even before we consider that question, all right. reason for that. What we need to understand is the relationship between metaphysics and physics. Physics, generally speaking, can exclude certain metaphysical conceptions, certain ultimate explanation of reality, but it doesn't determine or over-determine metaphysical conception, because our understanding of our physical explanations are never exhaustive. There's always a gap. That's why you can have a relativity physics and Einstein's Newton's physics still working side by side, because at the end of the day they are theoretical, or as a whole they are theoretical explanation, and those theoretical explanations are compatible with the variety of views about reality as a whole. So to think that any physical theory will deterministically determine our metaphysics or our notion of ultimate reality doesn't seem correct, seems too simplistic. So that's why this claim should be taken, the claim that for modern relativity physics this view is no longer tenable. This claim, see, it might be that for modern relativity physics it's no longer tenable, but that doesn't mean that that view is not tenable in itself, because among other things relativity physics is compatible with many, not all obviously, ultimate explanation of reality. And on the other hand, relativity physics is only one level of explanation. And the third thing is relativity physics has been superseded by other conception of physics, from quantum physics to string theory and whatnot. And basically physics is just a mathematical construction these days, at the level of general explanation. So the sixth point or fifth, I forgot which one was it, but the matter, a piece of matter has become not a persistent thing, with varying states, but a system of interrelated events. So there are many things we can say about this, but firstly, it's talking about matter, but it started with substance. That's the basic flaw in the argument. So it's not about matter. Even matter which goes through varying states, there's something which persists. Otherwise, that's the argument, not that matter persists as a whole. Something which persists. Otherwise, we can't conceive at the conceptual level. We can't conceive change in the first place. That's the argument. And that something is called substance. not matter as such. That's the 6A. Okay. And 6B is that whether we are talking about matter or events, system of, whether we are talking about chair or atoms. These are different levels of explanation. That doesn't nullify the basic concept that you can't. I'm not saying it can't be nullified with some other argument, but with this argument, it can't be nullified that in order to conceive change, we must have something which changes. If everything is changes at once, the change, it's hard to understand the meaning of change. That's okay. Maybe at mathematical level, but at from a logical level, it doesn't seem very plausible. Okay, the old solidity has gone. Yeah, solidity has gone, but solidity of firstly, solidity is still there. Like for a chair is solid. It depends on the level of explanation. Which level solidity is still there? That's the first point, and on which level it is gone. After all, the E is equal to mc squared, so matter and energy are interchangeable in that sense. But that doesn't mean that chair doesn't have any solidity. That's the first point. The second thing is solidity might be related to matter, but matter as such is not a substance. Substance is a category which the basic intuition behind that is you can't understand change without having something which changes. And if everything changes at once, then there can't be any conception of change. Maybe this argument is flawed, but that has to be dealt with at a different level than Mr. Russell is doing at this, if this is Mr. Russell's whole quote. Anyway, but obviously we are not concerned with Mr. Russell, we are concerned with Mr. Iqbal. So the old soul is gone, and it is the character that to the materials made matter seem more real than fleeting thoughts. So this is the argument against so-called materialism, not against substance as such. Because after all, you have in Descartes, matter is a substance for him in his sense, which is pure extension, and mind is a substance as well. So that has nothing to do with substance. So you can be materialist or idealist and can still believe in substance at a certain level of explanation. Okay. So I think we have covered Mr. Russell's argument, and that doesn't seem tenable. So next time, inshallah, let's go back to the text. Let's read what we have covered today. So Mr. Russell says that the theory of relativity by merging into space-time has damaged the traditional notion of substance. That he starts with substance. But then all the arguments of the philosophers. But he then matter. If this is actually Russell's quote, so I haven't checked it, but according to this, it seems it is. But anyway, if it's not Russell's quote and it's Iqbal's interpretation of what Russell is saying, then Iqbal's rendition is fallacious at certain levels. So he's talking about substance and then goes on matter to give the impression that substance and matter are the same thing, and so what applies to matter also applies to substance, but that's not right. So okay, so matter for common sense, and it's talking about common sense, not philosophy. So traditional concept of substance is not necessarily the same as, although it does drive upon common sense intuition, but you can't equate them, I think. So matter for common sense is something which persists in time and moves in space. But I said the traditional notion of substance, the basic, I think there are two basic intuition behind the traditional conception of substance. There are level of existence. There are things which, relatively speaking, are self-sufficiently sufficient, and the others which are not, relatively. So, for example, chair is self-sufficient in a way in which color is not. So, in that sense, chair is the substance and color is not. The second intuition is that when you explain change, you have to think of something which changes. You can't explain change, and that goes back to the debate between Parmenidians and Heracliteans. If everything changes, as Heraclitus said, then there's nothing which changes. So the whole notion of motion becomes untenable in that sense. And I'm not saying this is the argument which necessarily is decisive, but these are two important intuitions behind the notion of substance, and I don't think relativity can destroy, or any physics can destroy, these two notions or reject them decisively at certain level of explanation, at all levels of explanation. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so matter for common sense is something which persists, but for modern relativism, this is no longer tenable. Okay, so that will be against matter, not against substance. A piece of matter has become not a persistent thing with varying states, but a system of interrelated events. It doesn't matter because you still need those two intuitions to explain. Those two intuitions are not blown away by these things. Similarly, you can think of atoms. That doesn't mean that you can't sustain those two intuitions at a certain level of explanation. The old solidity is gone. It's not the matter of solidity, it's the matter of relative self-sufficiency in which things exist in this world. And where they declare the materialism model. So it's sort of argument that materialism is turning it into an argument against materialism in a very broad sense, against substance. So that seems to me a very flawed argument. Whatever. Okay, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassallallahu wasallam ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa ajma'in bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin.